Isn't tea so good? Dr. Hers thinks so too. Too bad I'm actually too lazy to make any, but Dr. Hers is part of the Taken for Granite one-shot scenario written by Jade Griffin. This is for Call of Cthulhu, and it takes about 4 hours to play. The scenario takes place in Granitville, Vermont, around Thanksgiving in 1922. Investigators are either residents of Granitville or visiting, and they find themselves in the Granite Diner at the start of the scenario. They're learning a little bit about the small town, learning all the gossip, when suddenly a car crashes through the Granite Diner windows. So this scenario certainly starts off with a bang. Moving forward, there will be spoilers. Right away, I loved that the scenario started off with action. It grabbed my investigators' attention immediately and gave them a little bit of a different feel from the normal Call of Cthulhu scenarios in which you're starting off with a slower investigative pace. Nope, this one starts with a car crashing through some windows. So let's find out what's really going on here. Dr. Hers, who is a psychiatrist and geologist, defies warnings about exploring the Rock of Ages quarry in Vermont. He goes and investigates, encounters some dead animals, and a mysterious voice called the Tone. He learns of the Tone's goal, which is to enter our reality using humans as conduits. Geoseeds must be grown in living hosts during a specific celestial alignment, and Dr. Hers becomes a conduit for the Tone. The Tone then manipulates influential figures like Father Romano to try and recruit other people to the cause. In particular, Dr. Hers uses hypnosis and a special teacup to enthrall potential hosts. This all culminates in a plan for mass infestation that will take place as a baptism later at the quarry. The antagonist in the scenario is called the Tone, and this is an alien being that's trying to get to Earth, but must make a bridge to get there, which is done through having X number of humans, 14 in this case, that are actually aligned with the Tone and can help bring this being to Earth. One of my top tips for running the scenario is leaning into the musical aspect of things. So look up actual music on YouTube or Spotify or something that you can play in the background and intersperse, and in particular use when one of your investigators, if they get enthralled. In addition, it makes the scenario really dynamic if you find ways to intersperse this musical theme throughout the scenario. So think of ways that you can add music in different places and call attention to it for the investigators to understand that this is something that's important to the core scenario. And it will help with them actually finding clues to figure out that they need to make a counter sound to disrupt what the Tone is trying to do. That was one of the most difficult things for this scenario and my players, is they didn't really get the pieces or the clues together to figure out how to defeat this Tone. So coming up with some ways to bring their attention to the musical aspect of things and perhaps put some emphasis on the science acoustic skill or something else that will draw their attention could be really helpful for your players during the scenario. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about choosing player characters. Now, this scenario does come with pre-generated characters, and I recommend using them. These characters have pretty strong ties to the town and relationships with people in the town that make the scenario feel more immersive. So for that reason, I definitely recommend using the pre-generated characters. That being said, I do think there is a little bit too much reliance on each individual PC. So I only had 3 players, which means 3 pre-gens weren't used. And I felt like there were chunks of the scenario that I had to, as a keeper, make up for and figure out a way to work in because these 3 pre-gens weren't being used. In particular, Annalise seemed to be the favorite PC because there were a lot of connections with her in the scenario. And if your players decide not to play with her, it could become a little bit more difficult for you as a keeper. It's written in that Annalise's mom is hypnotized and is later in trouble, but I changed this to a newly created NPC that would be more flexible as a friend to any of the PCs. At the start of play, I just chose one of the PCs to write down this NPC's name as a friend, and that is an additional connection that then I could be more flexible and work with and still have that storyline with within the scenario. Another call out with the PCs is Hyacinth has a strong connection to the occultist who owns the bookshop, and without Hyacinth, I felt like I had to push this in a particular direction to make that connection and make the different PCs know that that was a significant lead and part of the scenario. So perhaps spend a little bit of time brainstorming how those connections could be made earlier in the scenario, even if you're not playing with Hyacinth. At the beginning of play, make sure to tell your players to look at the back of their sheets. I know not everyone does that all the time, but there are really important relationships, things that they've seen in regards to the Quarry and the tone that's going to be really helpful throughout gameplay. So making sure that they're aware of those significant people and what they've seen is going to be really helpful for getting the scenario up and running at a good pace. Let's also spend a little bit more time on those relationships. So I thought this was a really cool part of the scenario and that there was written in relationships that could guide players throughout. However, it needed to be executed in a slightly different way for it to be effective for my players. I, as a keeper, knew all the information, but the players didn't really understand the significance of the relationships, and I felt like if the beginning had changed just a little bit so that they started all together at the diner and really introduced themselves or had conversation about these weird things that they've been seeing, some NPC that prompts those stories out of them could have been more helpful in that situation. And that is a change that's pretty easily made at the beginning before the car actually crashes into the diner. Okay, let's get to the core of the scenario now. After the car crashes into the diner, Father Romano is one of the first people to show up and help these boys that crashed, claiming it might be alcohol, and they definitely should not call the constable because it's prohibition and he wouldn't want them to get in trouble. So he gladly takes the boys away and tries to help them, get them secluded until they sober up. So right away, my players spotted some suspicion with the father, which is okay because it was a solid lead to go to the Catholic Church. Moving on to the core locations your players are going to investigate throughout the town. I do want to note that this is not a linear scenario. It felt very sandboxy, and I felt like my players had a lot of freedom to go where they wanted to go, which was a big plus. Where the struggle came in was the document wasn't organized in a super keeper-friendly way, so it did take me quite a while to prepare for the scenario and get organized and take some of my own notes so I could follow it during play. There was different headings, and while they had creative names to them, it wasn't intuitive to me as a keeper what each of those headings meant, and therefore it was harder for me to follow and plan, but also harder when I needed to reference something and I forgot where it was because the headings weren't super clear. So just expect that you might have to put in a little bit extra time when you're prepping this scenario. One of the locations are the Baptist and Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is connected to Father Romano, and the Baptist Church is connected to Pastor Ward. Father Romano tries to get the investigators to assume Ward took the boys in the end and that they're somehow connected to Ward and there's weird stuff going on there, but in the reality, Romano is keeping the boys in the basement to help convert them over to the tone. So the Catholic Church is a typical 1920s small town place of worship. The church is bustling with activity, with helpers preparing for the baptism. Father Romano is generally cooperative, but is spouting a lot of lies. It's possible that your investigators will choose to snoop in the Catholic Church. However, my players were never really motivated to go that far. But if they do, they might find the basement, which is holding people for this tone conversion. Likely this avenue of conversation will lead them to Pastor Ward and the Baptist Church. It's written that Pastor Ward is actually a Yithian in a pastor's body. This isn't directly connected to this scenario, but the scenario is part of a larger campaign if you choose to play it that way, and there are hints later in the campaign that does relate to the Yithian. However, as a keeper, I wasn't given the information to be able to play this really right, and it ended up being a little bit confusing. So if you are playing this as a one-shot, I would recommend entirely removing the Yithian line, just because this could be a huge rabbit hole for your players and lead them in a direction that's just gonna spiral and go nowhere. Pastor Ward is a pretty quiet guy, and he really has nothing to hide. He does give a little bit of hints to John Cooper, who owns the bookshop, and that might be a good direction for your players to go if they haven't already spoken to Cooper. This is a good time to note that if the captors in the basement of the Catholic Church are not freed by 6 p.m., Dr. Hers will come and complete their connection to the tone. So I did like that there was urgency, there's a timeline, the characters know that there's the baptism later that evening, so there is certainly that ticking time clock, and I felt like that helped move things along and give a little bit of oomph to the investigators and what they were trying to achieve. The first time they go, it'll probably be a shorter visit. Cooper knows there's something weird going on, and he says he's going to try and contact outside forces to try and figure it out. This is a great time to tell the investigators to come back to the bookshop later, because when they do, John is going to be murdered, which is an important plot point. But in the meantime, you'll also find out that they have a very occulty-like bookshop. There's a book in the back that might have some cool information as the investigators flip through it. And overall, he can give a little bit more context about the weird occurrences at the quarry. Next, we have the Harrigan household, and this is where Dr. Hers is staying. This is likely going to be a quick stop for the investigators, as when they walk into the house, they smell that something is not right. They'll pretty quickly find the bodies of Bridget and Sean Harrigan, which are victims of Dr. Hers' experiments with the tone. They ended up being unsuitable hosts for the tone and exploded in the process. The other important clue here is Dr. Hers' journal, which can provide a little bit more information about what's really going on here. From there, we move to the climax of the scenario. And now's a great time to talk about the infested table. So this table is something that your players may have to interact with if they get themselves in a situation where they're being hypnotized or taken over by the tone. And this did happen with my players, and it made for a really fun interaction. Now, the table itself was a little bit confusing to try and dissect and understand, as well as the little piece for the players felt like a mix of stuff for players and keepers, when I really would have liked something that I could just hand the player that is taken over by the tone so they had that secret information. Since this tone is so creative and there's some really cool rules with the GOCs and what's happening in this town, I would have liked more clarity about what is a suitable host versus what is not a suitable host, and consistency around what happens when the geoseeds are put into the humans. Because this made it a little bit more difficult for me to play the NPCs and know what was going to happen to them. And then when it came to the players, not feeling like there was a ton of consistency, so it was difficult for me to understand and follow. My tip for you as a keeper is to really spend some time dissecting the infestation table and applying those same sort of mechanics and effects to people in the town that are being exposed to these geoseeds. Eventually, all roads lead to the quarry, which, fun fact, this is a real place in Vermont. It's called the Rock of Ages Quarry, and it's quite beautiful. Depending on your player's choices, they may end up confronting Dr. Hers or Father Romano. My players went the Dr. Hers route because he was already at the quarry trying to destroy anything that could be a counter resonance to the tone. Now, my players didn't actually know what he was doing, but it didn't matter by that point because they knew that he was a bad guy and that he needed to be taken care of. So while he was in the shed, they may have locked him in and caught the shed on fire. But it was a good time. And eventually the baptismal march came down to the river in the quarry, as that was still happening since they had not taken care of Father Romano. Now, one of the investigators went a little bit crazy after seeing one of their friends unfortunately pass away from not being a suitable host. And that caused him to murder another PC. So that was fun. And then the third PC did succumb to the tone and was fully willing to be baptized. So overall, although they did take care of Dr. Hers, the tone did successfully come to Earth because he had all 14 humans that he needed to make that bridge. So it was overall a lose scenario for my players, but it was a really cool, fun, chaotic ending. So my overall thoughts, I thought the story itself was great and creative and really can be enhanced if you lean into the music factor that's going throughout the scenario. It was a heavy lift for keepers to understand and navigate the actual document, so be aware of that as you're going through planning for this. The pre-made relationships and connections with the PCs and NPCs in this Granite town was very helpful and cool, but make sure that your players know its importance by possibly spending a little bit more time on it in the beginning. The scenario was not linear, and I felt like my players had a lot of agency about where they wanted to go and what they wanted to do. And overall, I just loved our chaotic ending. So Taken for Granite is going to be linked in the description below. It's on the Miskatonic repository if you're interested. And I do have a Patreon if you'd like to support me and hear more of these scenario reviews and walkthroughs for Call of Cthulhu. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.